So chapter 4. On Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the villages along shore, the world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. He's a bootlegger, said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and flowers. One time he killed a man who had found out that he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose, honey, and pour me a last drop into that there crystal glass. This woman is calling Gatsby a bootlegger. A bootlegger would be someone during the Prohibition when alcohol was illegal. It would be someone selling alcohol, so selling an illegal product. Nowadays, people do sell illegal products on the streets, but we usually call them drug dealers. During the Prohibition, people sold alcohol. A lot of rich people wanted alcohol, and since the rich people wanted it, what might the police have done about it? Let it go because the rich people want it, right? Arrest the rich people? I don't think so. Right? Once I wrote down on the empty spaces of a timetable the names of all those who came to Gatsby's house that summer. It's an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds and headed this schedule in effect July 5th, 1922. But I can still read the gray names, and they'll give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. Okay, so Nick tells us that he wrote down all the names of the people at the party on a train schedule. And then, if you notice my highlighting here, he reads off all of these names. You can go back and read all these names if you want. I will highlight a couple of them. Okay, for instance, Chester, Beckers, and Leaches, and Bunsen, and some people who knows at Yale, Dr. Ribbits, all these people, and these people from East Egg. Okay, all these names. East Egg, as you remember, is the sort of more posh, rich section. So these are the people that have been rich their whole lives and whose families have been rich. And when these people come to the party, they have more of a tendency to dress in conservative clothing. The white suit that Nick wore, or black tuxedos, all these old posh people from East Egg. There's also people from West Egg, the Poles and Mulreadys and Cecil Roebuck and Schoen and Gulick. And a lot of these people have something to do with the movies. So it's kind of like Hollywoody, new money, fancy dresses, lots of fashion. They would come dressed up in the new 1920s fashion, not in the old-fashioned conservative clothing. We have all these names from West Egg. We even have a guy named Clip Springer who actually moves in and becomes a boarder, a guy that lives in Gatsby's house. And people that show up with extra girls, uh, and some guy they call the Duke. And all these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer. Okay. List of all the people, tons of people go to Gatsby's house. At 9 o'clock one morning in July, Gatsby's gorgeous car lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its three-noted horn. Doo-doo-doo! It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to two of his parties, mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation made frequent use of his beach. Good morning, old sport. You're having lunch with me today, and I thought we'd ride up together. So they're going to ride in Gatsby's fancy car into New York to go to lunch. He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work or rigid sitting in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous sporadic games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner in the shape of restlessness. He was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand. He saw me looking with admiration at his car. It's pretty, isn't it, old sport? He jumped off to get me a better view. Haven't you ever seen it before? I had seen it. Everybody had seen it. Apparently, He's got a car that is so fantastic and amazing that everybody in town has seen his fancy car. It was a rich cream color, bright with nickels swollen here and there in its monstrous length, with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and tool boxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Sitting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps half a dozen times in the past month, and found, to my disappointment, that he had little to say. So my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. Oh, so he thought Gatsby was an interesting rich guy, and it just turns out he's just the guy that throws big parties. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached West Egg Village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel suit. Look here, old sport, he broke out surprisingly. What is your opinion of me, anyhow? Arr? A little overwhelmed, I began the generalized evasions which that question deserves. Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life, he interrupted. I don't want you to get a wrong idea of me from all these stories you hear. Ah, so he was aware of the bizarre accusations that flavored conversations in his halls. I'll tell you the God's truth. His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand by. I don't know about you guys, but when someone says, I'll tell you the truth, I immediately suspect them of lying. Like, why do you have to tell me you're going to tell me the truth? Don't you always tell the truth? Maybe only sometimes tell the truth? I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, all dead now. I was brought up in America, but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. It's a family tradition. He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed that he was lying. He hurried the phrase educated in Oxford, or swallowed it or choked on it, as though it had bothered him before. And with this doubt, his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him after all. What part of the Middle West? I inquired casually. San Francisco. I see. Because, of course, Nick knows San Francisco's all the way west. It's not Middle West. My family all died, and I came into a good deal of money. His voice was solemn, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment, I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. After that, I lived like a young Raha in all the capitals of Europe, Paris, Venice, Rome, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, and trying to forget something very sad that happened to me long ago. With an effort, I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except that of a turbaned character leaking sawdust at every pore as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne. So Gatsby's painting of himself looks like some guy in a movie. And this is one of those old movies, 1920s. You're talking like silent pictures and stuff. Then came the war, old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted a commission as first lieutenant when it began. In the Argonne Force, I took two machine gun detachments so far forward that there was only a half-mile gap on either side of us, where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns, and when the infantry came up at last, they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. I was promoted to be a major, and every Allied government gave me a decoration. Even Montenegro, little Montenegro down on the Adriatic Sea. Ah, little Montenegro. He lifted up the words and nodded them at me with his smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. So Nick is listening to this story. He's almost laughing to himself and thinking, this came out of a magazine. These are magazine stories. He reached into his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. That one is from Montenegro. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. Orderi di Danilio, ran the circular legend. Montenegro Nicholas Rex. Turn it. Major J. Gatsby, I read, for valor extraordinary. Here's another thing I always carry, a souvenir of Oxford days. It was taken in the Trinity Quad. The man on my left is now the Earl of Doncaster. It was a photograph of a half dozen young men in blazers loafing in an archway through which were visible a host of spires. And there was Gatsby, looking a little, not much younger, with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming in his palace on the Grand Canal. I saw him opening a chest of ruby to ease with the crimson lighted depths the gnawings of his broken heart. I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction. So I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there trying to forget the sad thing that happened to me. He hesitated. You'll hear about it this afternoon. At lunch? No, this afternoon. I happened to find out that you're taking Miss Baker to tea. You mean you're in love with Miss Baker? No, no, old sport, I'm not. But Miss Baker has kindly consented to speak to you about this matter. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure the request would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry I had ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of a red-belted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobble slum lined with the dark, undeserted saloons of the faded, gilt 1900s. And then the Valley of Ashes opened up on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of Miss Wilson straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. Okay, so they're driving to New York. Gatsby's talking, trying to say something to Nick about Jordan telling him a story. And we drive through the Valley of Ashes, that section where the Wilsons live, where the factories are. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half Long Island City. Only half, for as we twisted along the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar juk juk spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. All right, old sport, called Gatsby, and slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. Right you are, agreed the policeman, tipping his cap. I'll know you next time, Mr. Gatsby. Excuse me. What was that? I inquired. The picture of Oxford? I was able to do the commissioner a favor once, and he sends me a Christmas card every year. Wait a minute. So Gatsby's getting pulled over in his car, and all he does is show the commissioner's card and he gets out of it? Why would the policeman let him out of a ticket? The commissioner is his boss. And the policeman knows how things work. And the rich people, what do? They get away with everything. Over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders making a constant flicker upon the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built with a wish out of the non-olfactory money. The city seen from the Queensboro Bridge is always the city seen for the first time, in its first wild promise of all the mystery and beauty of the world. A dead man passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by two carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe. Is that describing people with tragic eyes and short upper lips? Is that racist? And I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their somber holiday. And as we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us driven by a white chauffeur in which sat three modish, I don't know this word, if it's racist or not. I'm starting to wonder about Nick. So three black guys sitting in a chauffeured car, two bucks and a girl. Now I know it's racist. Referring to a black man as a buck is referring to him as a male deer. That's totally referring to him as an animal. That's racist. So we find out Nick, maybe he's not as bad as Tom, but Nick's a racist too. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled towards us in haughty rivalry. Okay, Nick, now you totally got me. We find out Nick's a racist. Anything can happen now that we slid over this bridge, I thought. Anything at all. Even Gadsby could happen without any particular wonder. I'm going to stop right there for a second. I'm going to ask you guys to go to your chapter 4 group work. So chapter 4 group work. You're going to actually, let me pause. Roaring noon in a well-fanned 42nd Street cellar, I met Gadsby for lunch. Blinking away the brightness of the street outside, my eyes picked him out obscurely in the anteroom talking to another man. Mr. Conway, this is my friend, Mr. Wolfsheim. A flat-nosed Jew raised his heart. Like, I'm not sure that that's the appropriate way to refer to some guy that's Jewish. A small, flat-nosed Jew raised his large head and regarded me with two fine growths of hair which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment, I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. Either Nick or the narrator is distributing racism. So's, I took one look at him, said Mr. Wolfsheim, shaking my hand earnestly. And what do you think I did? What? I inquired politely. But evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. I handed the money to Gatsby and I said, all right, Gatsby, don't pay him a penny till he shuts his mouth. And he shut it then and there. Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Wolfsheim swallowed a new sentence he was starting and lapsed into a somnambulatory abstraction. That's like sleep. Highballs? Asked the head waiter. That means drinks. This is a nice restaurant here, said Mr. Wolfsheim, looking at the Presbyterian nymphs on the ceiling. But I like across the street better. Yes, highballs, agreed Mr. Gatsby. And then to Mr. Wolfsheim. It's too hot over there. Hot and small, yes, said Mr. Wolfsheim, but full of memories. What place is that? I asked. The old Metropole. The old Metropole, brooded Mr. Wolfsheim gloomily, filled with faces dead and gone, filled with friends gone now forever. I can't forget so long as I live the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there. There was 6 of us at the table, and Rosie had eaten and drunk a lot that evening. And when it was almost morning, the waiter came up to him with a funny look and says, somebody wants to speak to him outside. All right, says Rosie, and he begins to get up. And I pulled him down in his chair. Let the bastards come in here if they want you, Rosie, but don't you so help me move outside this room. It was 4 o'clock in the morning then, and if we'd raised the blinds then, we'd have seen daylight. Did he go? I asked innocently. Sure he went. Mr. Wolfsheim's nose flashed at me indignantly. He turned around in the door and says, don't let the waiter take away my coffee. And then he went out on the sidewalk, and they shot him 3 times in his full belly and drove away. 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering. 5 with Becca. His nostrils turned to me in an interested way. I understand you're looking for a business connection. The juxtaposition of these 2 remarks was startling. Gatsby answered for me. Oh no, he exclaimed. This isn't the man. No? Mr. Wolfsheim seemed disappointed. This is just a friend. I told you we'd talk about that sometime later. I beg your pardon, said Mr. Wolfsheim. I had a wrong man. You think you'd want to get into business with Wolfsheim? Get a business connection going with some guy that knows people who get shot when they go to lunch? I don't know. A succulent hash arrived, and Mr. Wolfsheim, forgetting the more sentimental atmosphere of the old metropole, began to eat with ferocious delicacy. His eyes, meanwhile, roved very slowly all around the room. He completed the art by turning to inspect the people directly behind me. I think that, except for my presence, he would have taken one short glance beneath our own table. Look here, old sport, said Gatsby, leaning towards me. I'm afraid I made you a little angry this morning in the car. There was a little smile again, but this time I held out against it. I don't like mysteries, I answered, and I don't understand why you won't come out frankly and tell me what you want. Why has it all got to come through Miss Baker? Oh, it's nothing underhand, he assured me. Miss Baker's a great sportswoman, you know, and she'd never do anything that wasn't right. Which, of course, we know that Jordan Baker cheats at golf, leaves people's cars out in the rain, drives carelessly. Suddenly, he looked at his watch and he jumped up and hurried from the room, leaving me with Mr. Wolfsheim at the table. He has to telephone, said Mr. Wolfsheim, following him with his eyes. A fine fellow, isn't he? Handsome to look at, and a perfect gentleman. Yes. He's an Oxford man. Oh. He went to Oxford College in England. You know Oxford College? I've heard of it. It's one of the most famous colleges in the world. Have you known Gatsby for some time? I inquired. Several years, he answered in a gratified way. I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war, but I knew I had discovered a man of fine breeding after I talked with him for an hour. I said to myself, there's the kind of man you like to take home and introduce to your mother and your sister. He paused. I see you looking at my cuff buttons. I hadn't been looking at them, but I did now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory. Finest specimens of human molars, he informed me. Well, I inspected them. That's a very interesting idea. Yeah, he flipped up the sleeves under his coat. Why the heck would he have molars on his shirt? Did he save them from when he was a kid? Does he have a dentist who's a friend? Did he kill somebody who talked too much and took his teeth? Yeah, Gatsby's very careful about women. He would never so much as look at a friend's wife. When the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and sat down, Mr. Wolfsheim drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. I've enjoyed my lunch, he said, and I'm going to run off from you two young men before I outstay my welcome. Don't hurry, Meyer, said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsheim raised a hand in a sort of benediction. You're very polite, but I belong to another generation, he announced solemnly. You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies and your... He supplied an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. As for me, I'm 50 years old and I won't impose myself on you any longer. As he shook hands and turned away, his tragic nose was trembling. I wondered if I had said anything to offend him. He becomes very sentimental sometimes, exclaimed Gatsby. This is one of his sentimental days. He's quite a character around New York, a denizen of Broadway. Who is he, anyhow? An actor? No. A dentist? Huh. Meyer Wolfsheim? No. He's a gambler. Gatsby hesitated and then added coolly, he's the man who fixed the World Series back in 1990. Fixed the World Series? I repeated. The idea staggered me. I remembered, of course, that the World Series had been fixed in 1990, but if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as a thing that merely happened, the end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the fate of 50 million people with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. How did he happen to do that? I asked after a minute. He just saw the opportunity. Why isn't he in jail? They can't get him, old sport. He's a smart man. What? Mr. Wolfsheim's a gambler? He's a bookie? He's an illegal bet taker? And he fixed the World Series? I'm starting to think he was connected with organized crime. I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I caught sight of Tom Buchanan across the crowded room. Oh, Tom Buchanan, that's his college acquaintance. So he's with Gatsby, his neighbor, and he now sees his college acquaintance. Come along with me for a minute, I said. I got to say hello to someone. And when he saw us, Tom jumped up and took a half dozen steps in our direction. Where have you been? He demanded eagerly. Daisy is furious because you haven't called up. This is Mr. Gatsby. Mr. Buchanan? They shook hands briefly, and a strange, unfamiliar look of embarrassment came over Gatsby's face. How have you been, anyhow? Demanded Tom of me. How'd you happen to come this far to eat? I've been having lunch with Mr. Gatsby. I turned towards Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there. Dun, dun, dun.